Welcome to this episode of the Viking Virtual Resident Historian. It's part of our ongoing cultural enrichment program and our commitment to destination-focused learning. A series that takes you further with unique perspectives and intriguing insights. It analyzes and puts into context important chapters of world history. The Viking Virtual Resident Historian puts history at your fingertips. We hope you'll find this episode enriching.
Hello, and welcome to another Viking Iconic Lecture as part of the Viking Resident Historian program. My name is Charles Doherty. Our examination of the Italian Renaissance requires us first to go back and look at what Europe was like before the year 1400. Not only considering what used to be called the Dark Ages, this was really a period more of an age of migration, what life was like in those years after the fall of the Roman Empire in around the 5th century BC until the early medieval period after the year 1000. So considering first what Europe was like in those centuries well before the Italian Renaissance, and then as well thinking about the difficulties associated with religious wars, military conflict, let alone the plague. This will set the stage for us before we explore some of the many triumphs of the Italian Renaissance. We're going to be looking at artists and thinkers, the movers and shakers in a variety of different disciplines, from literature, let alone the scientific community. We'll also consider just how and why this phrase, a Renaissance man, became part of the English language and recognize its relevance to this important chapter of world history. And then we turn our attention to why the Italian Renaissance matters, thinking about why and how we see remnants of the Italian Renaissance way of thinking in our everyday lives in the 21st century. This period that used to be called the Dark Ages is a somewhat ambiguous, if not partially inaccurate term. Scholarship, let's say some 50 years ago, might have conveniently labeled those centuries after the fall of Rome, let's say between the 5th century, but prior to the great reawakening of Christianity in the early 11th century, calling this period the Dark Ages. Yes, scholars have dwelled upon these bleaker aspects of Germanic tribes, like the Goths and Visigoths, drifting southward, creating unease among previously Roman-controlled European settlements. But these years also allowed historians to dwell upon the less savory aspects of the explorations and expeditions of these northerners as they came west, south, and east. But for our purposes, the term Dark Ages is a bit too stark, a bit too dark. Let's cast a little bit more light. Let's call them gray, this period of migration in pre-medieval Europe. Let's recognize that monasteries were actively transcribing the Gospels and copying small images of saints and disciples in ivory, and perpetuating the story of Christianity within their cloistered compounds. Charlemagne and his Holy Roman Empire were active in the 10th century. So the monastery life and the world of Charlemagne on the doorstep of this period we refer to as the true medieval era deserve a few moments of our attention. In early 11th century, we find the great movement across Western Europe to build Romanesque churches. Romanesque churches will be replaced by Gothic-style churches in the 12th and 13th centuries. And this reawakening of Christianity provided some stability after those unsettling years, centuries of difficult Germanic invasions. Yet these years were still difficult ones, with long-lasting religious wars. Also remember the Crusades, campaigns of religious zealotry from the late 11th to the late 13th centuries, in which European Christians embarked upon incursions into the Middle East. Such feverish attempts to hold back the perceived and real advances of the Islamic world caused added dislocation and unease during these pre-Renaissance years. We also turn our attention to the image you see in the middle. Considering the hardship, fear, and real dangers associated with the Black Death or plague that arrives on cargo ships to Italy in 1343. Spreading to the west and north via cargo over the next 3 to 5 years, it will rob local communities of some 40 or perhaps 60% of their populations, as the mysterious rat flea bacterium would spread rapidly. So although there were monumental churches like the glorious Lincoln Cathedral you see on the left, that would dominate the European horizons, we must not forget that warfare, as you see on the right, was prevalent, and the macabre dance of death associated with the powerful plague was indeed unavoidable during these years before 1400. Before the 15th century, the region we know as Italy today was a series of city-states, locally controlled regions generally under the power of wealthy families or local governance, yet largely still under the influence of the Roman Catholic Church. You see here 5 such principal Italian city-states: Florence, Rome, Venice, Genoa, and Milan. The expansion of trade networks and the resulting wealthy families allowed for the prosperity of cities. And we find that the maritime powerhouse of Venice under the Doges is quite different from the model of economic expansion in Milan. But eventually, with confidence resulting from newly found wealth, urban improvements were undertaken, not to mention the patronage of local artists, artisans, and architects, and the increasing interest in what we will identify as humanism. In order to appreciate the rise of humanism, we need to recognize that there were major centers of humanistic thought, not just Florence and Rome and Venice, but as well in Mantua and Ferrara. Within each of these centers, a new type of thinker or philosopher emerges. And we might see Petrarch, who you see there in the middle. From a Florentine family, although born in nearby Arezzo, he is sometimes known as the father of humanism and was certainly the greatest scholar of his times. Renowned for the discovery of letters from Cicero in an archive in Verona, he was also a great collector of original manuscripts of the Greco-Roman era. He went on to become the important figure advocating the 5 key subjects you see there on the left: rhetoric, grammar, poetry, history, and moral philosophy were all important for this new emerging gentleman who was taking on, with great gusto, learning about the world and able to defend and argue one's point of view. Note his portrait in the center, but also an illustration from his translation of the work of Virgil on the right. On his deathbed, Petrarch was found the next morning, resting his head upon a manuscript of Virgil. But let us turn to the subject of humanism during the Renaissance. It was reviving the cultural legacy of the classical world through the reading of ancient texts that were reappearing during these years of the 14th and 15th centuries. The study of these 5 key subjects that you see there would allow one to better tackle these questions of human existence and increase the awareness of the world around one. Humanist thought augments religious doctrine, and the two are not mutually exclusive. We find members of the church, including in the papacy, who will adopt aspects of humanist thinking for bettering the world. Contemporaneous with Petrarch are 2 seminal writers of the early Renaissance, again in these years leading up to the 15th century. Both Dante and Boccaccio, that you see appearing here, in particular wove rich and colorful tales of the human condition in the years before and during the Great Plague, questioning man's existence during years of trauma and uncertainty. Dante, sometimes referred to as the father of the Italian language, was a pioneer in moving away from Latin, the language of the church and the educated elite, moving toward writing the poems in his vernacular Tuscan dialect. His classic of Italian literature, first known as the Comedy, but later ascribed the title The Divine Comedy, traces his soulful journey towards God in 3 episodes. His 3 episodes through Hell, the Inferno, Purgatory, and the Third Paradise. Begun in the year around 1308 and finished around 1320, Dante's Divine Comedy set the standard for later writers like Petrarch and Boccaccio. Boccaccio, who you see on the right, studied and collected ancient scrolls and was fond of the ancient Greek language. The title of his classic 14th century Italian masterpiece, Decameron, derives from those 2 ancient Greek words, deca, meaning 10, and hemera, meaning day. This refers to that 10-day period during which his 10 young men and women, there were 3 men and 7 women, who, escaping the horrors of the Black Death, have secluded themselves in a villa outside Florence. Consisting of some 100 tales from the erotic and comical to the traumas of tragic love, it tells of the underlying life lessons during such dark days of the plague. Probably written around 1348, it was finished by 1353. As mentioned, we're going to explore so many of the movers and shakers that are part of the Renaissance world. Everyone from architects and artists, writers and thinkers, let alone the scientists and explorers who will define these centuries between the 14th and 16th centuries in Italy. We'll also consider this term Renaissance man, a term familiar to all of us, but try to understand what it means to be interested and curious about the world around one, not just in one's area of comfort of architecture, sculpture, painting, but as well thinking about issues of science and about the existence of mankind, underpinning the various philosophic reasons for all of us to exist in this complex world. It's not just about the retrieval or the revival of the Greco-Roman world, but it's as well about the discovery, the self-discovery that comes with the pursuit of knowledge and tackling the problems around one. In considering just what humanism involved and how it became so important in these Italian city-states, we need to turn to Florence to consider just how infectious it was across all walks of life. And in thinking about human triumphs in the world of finance, what better place to start than with the rise of the Medici family? They adopted humanist principles, and their world of banking and finance will lead to important patronage and sponsorship of artists and architects. The Medici family epitomizes how various components of 15th century Florentine life, this new social, political, artistic, and economic powerhouse, all become so intertwined. Their sponsorship will fuel advances across all of the artistic and learned worlds, among artists, sculptors, architects, not to mention ramifications for science and exploration at the end of the century. First, a bit of background. The Medici Bank was founded by Giovanni, who you see on the left, in the late 14th century. He was essentially the first de' Medici millionaire. A wool trader, trading with England and other traders in the north, he and later generations, like his grandson Cosimo in the center, would build elaborate palazzi. Giovanni set the stage for Cosimo and later generations to sponsor generations of Italian artists of the 15th and 16th centuries. Note the grand Palazzo Medici Riccardi. Utilizing rusticated stone, its massive walls resemble those of a Roman wall or fortification, rather than a decorative house of the richest man of Florence. Inside the house were extraordinary riches, some of the finest murals and frescoes of the 15th century, not to mention an important sculpture by the mid-15th century sculptor Donatello. From the triumphs and advances in banking and finance, we see the development and expansion of architectural designs and innovations. Inspired by their long-dormant Greco-Roman models of some 1,500 years earlier, the new Florentine structures will employ aspects of the earlier Greek temples and then translate them through civic Roman designs. For example, you see here on the screen everything from ground plans to domes to arches. There's facades with classically inspired columns and pilasters with capitals familiar to us, the orders, the Doric, the Ionic, the Corinthian, atop the columns that you see there on the upper right. Eventually, classically inspired sculpture will ornament the riches of the exterior facades and registers of side chapels within. Even humanistic principles of acute observation and appreciation of human anatomy and proportions will bring biblical stories and their saints and disciples to life. Remember the ruins and relics of old columns and capitals, the decoration from old buildings that had been in ruins across central Italy. Many of these are being excavated, rediscovered, and found, providing inspiration for our 15th century Florentine architects. What better means of exemplifying those ancient Greek and Latin texts showing the ideals of a human-based society than utilizing Greco-Roman design? The Renaissance city fathers and wealthy patrons will compete amongst themselves as the most civic, as the most sophisticated, and again compete with their neighboring Italian city-states. There will be design competitions put forward by the city fathers, soliciting bids and proposals for architectural projects throughout the 15th century. One such design competition among the artists and architects of Florence was to solve a problem that had been in existence for over 100 years. How to fill a hole in the top of the Florence Cathedral known as the Duomo. The design competition, launched in 1418, sought to find a winner who could solve this problem of building a dome over the magnificent Florence Cathedral. The winner was Filippo Brunelleschi, who even upon selection as the winner of the competition would fail to reveal his method for constructing such a colossal dome. His masterful proposal, and I think you can see it in schematic drawing in the upper left, it's two domes, one nesting within the other. His innovations, including the harnessing structures with large tension rings, like those used in making barrels for wine. He also erected inexpensive scaffolding, so there were no bulky flying buttresses like those that support the Milan Cathedral, the main structure of their rival city-state to the north. During its consecration ceremony in 1436, then Pope Eugenius I declared it, quote, more powerful and honorable than any building ever designed. Another means of identifying a triumph of the Renaissance is through the rebirth of classicism in sculpture. Also in Florence, another competition among local artists was held for designing the bronze doors on the exterior of the baptistry, a building adjacent to the Florence Cathedral. The winner was a 23-year-old local goldsmith and sculptor named Lorenzo Ghiberti. Ironically, his design beat out the one proposed by his highly favored and more eminently renowned competitor, Brunelleschi. He was the designer of the Florence Cathedral dome. It took Ghiberti some 27 years to create his sculptural masterpiece, and in all, he produced 2 sets of doors. Let's look more closely at one set of doors shown here. Each panel tells a different story from the Old Testament, and one, which I've included there in the upper right, tells the story of Jacob and Esau. Why these are so important in the history of art and sculpture is that Ghiberti uses mathematical principles to skillfully render accurate perspective in a flat space, while telling multiple aspects of the story at the same time. Also note Ghiberti's self-portrait enlarged for you there on the left, which he included in one of those narrow vertical frames for one of the panels. The term, lovingly used to describe the magnificence of Ghiberti's bronze doors, comes to us from Michelangelo, who upon seeing them for the very first time, called them the gates of paradise. A beautiful way to understand how classicism and the Greco-Roman world will infuse Florentine painting, we turn to an important work from around 1425 by the artist Masaccio. It tells the story of the tribute money, in which Christ, informed that he has to find money to pay the tax collector, instructs St. Peter to go to search for a coin in the mouth of a nearby fish. Many of the earlier depictions of the human form, let's say in the 14th century, involved naive portrayals or inadequate understanding of human proportions. Such awkward bodies and proportions might be akin to those of you recalling the work of Giotto, the Italian artist of some 125 years earlier. Now Masaccio, in his portrayal of the biblical story from the life of St. Peter, as described in the Gospel of Matthew, we find the story told in 3 episodes. First, as you see Christ in the center of the painting, wearing pink and blue gowns. Note how Masaccio has chosen to tell this biblical story. All the figures are wearing Roman togas. What's important for us is the fact that we have more attention to human anatomy, yet the human proportions are not yet perfectly rendered. Note, for example, how he attempts to portray the drapery folds, which hang more naturally but skillfully cover up the details of the human form beneath. We must note the skillful rendering or attempts to do single-point perspective. This means of portraying a believable foreground, middle ground, and background. The suggestion of invisible sightlines that appear to emanate from the lower right corner of the painting, diagonally positioned with those steps that lead our eye between the legs of Peter and the tax collector, underneath the arches of the porch on the right, and off towards the distant landscape, far behind Christ's head. Masaccio attempts to portray mathematically, almost using his proverbial compass and protractor, to paint the lines of recession to create the impression of a believable foreground and background. This will be powerfully rendered with even more careful precision by our other Italian masters of the High Renaissance some 70 years later: Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci. In thinking about our big three of the Renaissance, we need to address the purposes of chronology. Masaccio, who we just looked at in his portrayal of the tribute money, were painted during what might be called the early Renaissance, which may have spanned some 50 years, approximately between 1425 and 1475. The High Renaissance, for our purposes, might be proscribed from the years 1490 to 1510. Each of these three figures, Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Raphael, deserve our careful attention, and each might be viewed to live up to this term, a Renaissance man. Michelangelo, for example, was a sculptor, painter, and architect. Leonardo da Vinci was a true polymath, an artist, inventor, scientist, draftsman, astronomer, and mathematician, and the list could go on. Raphael was an incredibly prolific artist and architect, but only sadly lived to the age of 37. We can only imagine what he might have produced had he lived longer. Let's begin with Michelangelo. All of us are aware of the Sistine Chapel and perhaps recall aspects of this story. However, it contains work by other artists, not just Michelangelo, and involves much more than just the ceiling. The Sistine Chapel that you see on the left is the site of the papal conclave, where new popes are chosen. Thus, one of the most important of many chapels within the greater Vatican complex. It doesn't look like much from the outside, simple, monochromatic brick, but it's inside where we find the important part of our story. Among the notable Italian artists whose works grace the walls of the chapel are frescoes and paintings by Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and Perugino, as well as tapestries by Raphael. So some of these paintings were finished some 20 to 40 years before Michelangelo's ceiling. Michelangelo would be commissioned to paint that frescoed ceiling by Pope Julius II in the year 1508. It was painted only by Michelangelo from scaffolding some 70 feet above the ground. He worked on it between 1508 and 1512. Let's focus for a moment on the location of 9 broad rectangles. These appear vertically at the center of that long rectangular hall. Here we see details of 2 of these 9 rectangles at the top. These 9 scenes illuminate episodes from the book of Genesis. The ceiling contains some 300 biblical figures in all, telling primarily the story of creation, mankind's fall from grace, and ultimate salvation by God, supposedly strictly within the traditions of the Catholic Church. However, within all of Michelangelo's subjects, he revels in the celebrations of both the male and female form, their anatomical beauty, and their nobility when juxtaposed alongside mankind's weaker and more sinful nature. Remarkable biblical vignettes you see here: the creation of Adam, familiar to all of us on the upper left, the expulsion from the Garden of Eden in the upper right. As well, I mentioned there were 300 biblical figures, telling, for example, in the lower left, the prophet Jonah, or in the lower right, Jacob and Joseph. Notice the lively, interacting human forms, with bodies whose musculature and anatomical details are both skillfully rendered, but yet telling the biblical stories in a new, more humanist way. So we are then led to ask the question, why is the ceiling such an extraordinary accomplishment? Is it merely the sheer size and the scale of the commission? Well, that's certainly part of it, but also the extraordinarily difficult conditions to execute it from scaffolding some 70 feet off the ground. Moreover, the complexity of narrative and the sheer monumental nature of telling so many biblical stories with such careful and insightful details all lead us to recognize the intelligence of this genius artist as one who stands, as we often do, in awe on the floor of the Sistine Chapel below. One tends to overlook any crinks in one's neck or awkward positions of one's shoulders when taking in the details of such a masterful ceiling soaring overhead. We haven't talked about the colors that Michelangelo was using in fresco high above the Sistine Chapel. We know by virtue of 500 some years of burning of candles and incense, not to mention the stray pollution that would drift in from the out of doors, the fact that the colors were more subdued and dulled and imprinted with many centuries of smoke. So there was a rather contentious conservation project undertaken in the 1980s and 90s to strip some of that excess smoke and pollution and the burning of incense off of the surface of the ceiling to reveal what was hoped to be Michelangelo's true intention, the colors he had put on that ceiling between 1508 and 1512. Notice, for example, on the right, there are two images, essentially a before and an after. You can see in the before that the colors are a little bit more gray, a little bit more muted, a little bit more mysterious, not as apparent as they are in that image on the far right. Not to mention the accentuation of the seated figure, clearly isolated from the background niche. On the one hand, are the new colors too intense? Do we see the figures as more corporeal, more rounded, perhaps more real? We'll never know whether Michelangelo's intended varnish or overlay may have intended to reduce or eliminate to some degree the intensity of those colors that you see on the right. Also note on the left, the powerful and extremely complex painting that Michelangelo undertook late in his career. This image on the one end of the Sistine Chapel portrays his powerful Last Judgment. The intertwine of figures, of dramatic scenes, interpreting this seminal story of the Bible can't help but capture our attention. And note, please, how very different it is from those exciting years between 1508 and 1512 when he was doing the ceiling. Funnily enough, when Michelangelo was first approached to paint the Sistine ceiling, he was hesitant because he thought of himself more of a sculptor than a painter. And I think these two well-known examples, human triumphs, if there ever were two wonderful, glorious examples of Italian Renaissance sculpture, you see the familiar David on the left and his very important Pietà on the right. While the Pietà depicting the Madonna and Christ is virtually life-size, the monumental David is much grander, measuring over 17 feet in height. In each, Michelangelo captures the psychological dimensions associated with the telling of these two very different stories. Yet in each, the sense of the momentary is captured, of something fleeting or ephemeral, now captured in perpetuity in the hard Carrara marble. David is shown just before hurling that stone towards the approaching but distant Goliath. His gaze is fixed, his right leg engaged, his body about to twist, allowing for his left hand and arm bearing the stone to bend backwards for what is hoped to be the stone's powerful trajectory. The Pietà, however, captures those most private and tender moments as the Virgin holds the limp body of Christ seemingly draped across her lap. Unlike previous artistic renditions of this important story from the Bible, Michelangelo chooses to show the Mary as the young, eternally beautiful Virgin, immortal and timeless, who once bore and gave birth to the infant Jesus. Michelangelo's understanding and mastery of anatomy, not to mention the mastery of portraying drapery folds, all combined for a believable, natural, and lifelike telling of these dramatic psychological stories. Another important Renaissance man deserving our attention is Leonardo da Vinci, a name familiar to us all. And this first page here introduces us to his amazing observational skills in capturing life that was visible, but as well life that he was imagining and inventing. There are some 5,000 sketchbook pages which exist. You can see in the center an image of a fetus in the womb that would have been done either from life or possibly in an autopsy. You can also see on the right his careful study of a human arm, elbow, with ligaments and tendons and various descriptions that he's writing to accompany his drawings. And perhaps most surprisingly, let's turn to the sketch in the lower center of a rather familiar but unexpected device. It's Leonardo's early flying machine. Our Renaissance genius was dreaming of mankind in flight, and how extraordinary this is some 400 years before the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk. He would also sketch early versions of the parachute, of a helicopter, even underwater submersible vehicles. His limitless curiosity continues to reward us even after 500 years. What we find most clearly demonstrated in the work of Leonardo is not just the revival of classical thought and inquiry, but the discovery of how to apply such careful thought to the understanding of the mechanics of the world, and how such careful observation might be applied to improve the world around him. His pioneering observation skills, understanding of mechanics, and their application to problem solving have served as the benchmarks of scientific inquiry ever since. In a further exploration of Leonardo as a Renaissance man, we turn to the subject of painting, with two wonderful examples you see before you. His Virgin Child with St. Anne on the left, and that very familiar image, this famous portrait of Mona Lisa in the center. Virgin Child and St. Anne dates from around 1503. The Mona Lisa, perhaps around 1503 to 1506. He tackles the human form in paintings using the eye of a scientist and the precision of a mathematician, while also capturing the psychological moment in paint. And it comes through an acute understanding of perspective, elements within nature which logically recede into the distance. He also employs sfumato, a painterly technique creating a smoke-like haze seen in both of these paintings, not only in the landscapes in the far distance, but also this soft, carefully blended atmospheric haze, lending a solemn or sacred dignity to the faces of the figures. And I think you can see a little bit of that lovely sfumato in the face of Mona Lisa on the far right. Another familiar painting to all of us is Leonardo's Last Supper, painted between 1495 and 98 for an eating hall, a refractory, at Santa Maria del Carmine in Milan. Note there's a door frame that cuts into the composition in the lower center of the picture. Among his many accomplishments are the skillful use of mathematics to create what's known as single-point perspective, clearly differentiating the foreground figures from the middle ground architectural space behind them to the distant landscape seen out those vertical windows in the background. Recall the early Renaissance master Masaccio in his tribute money some 70 years earlier. His was an attempt at accomplishing this effect of believable distance in space. However, there is more mathematics involved in using these schematic orthogonal lines. Note the insert in the upper right-hand corner to understand Leonardo's hypothetical lines of composition, in which all receding lines are associated with Christ's head as the focal point of the composition. Let's consider the psychological. How was Leonardo employing observational skills involving the psychological portrayal of his disciples to tell this story so powerfully? Notice he has grouped the 12 disciples into clusters of 3. And as you scan their heads left to right, notice perhaps one disciple who has a head lower than the level of the others on that horizontal line. Notice one that may be bathed in a bit more shadow, looking a little bit darker than the others. And if we were able to look up closely at this fresco, you'd notice that that same figure has his hand in a coin purse, seeming to retrieve a silver coin. That indeed is Judas. And so we find ourselves in viewing this painting, aware of and studying how these disciples intermingle and interact in their clusters of 3. But yet we're drawn to the head of Christ in the center of the composition, who's offering us the bread and wine, essentially involving us as viewers, as Christians, to be a part of this Last Supper scene. Finally, let's turn to our third Renaissance man, Raphael, a skillful painter and architect who participated in the competition to design the new St. Peter's, the cathedral in the Vatican. It would become the next major Italian church after the Florence Cathedral with Brunelleschi's dome. But there are almost 200 years between the competition for that new dome won by Brunelleschi and the consecration at St. Peter's in 1626. But it's Raphael's paintings that reward us in this lecture. He painted both mythological and religious subject matter in both oil and in fresco, as we'll see in a moment. Note here his tour de force depictions of the Madonna and Child. 3 Madonnas, the one on the left known as the Sistine Madonna, commissioned by Pope Julius II in 1512, and in the upper center, his Madonna and Child with St. John. On the far right, Madonna of the Goldfinch, again portraying the Madonna, Christ Child, and the infant St. John the Baptist. A Raphael Madonna epitomizes the tender, loving portrayal of motherhood, realistically rendered with precise brushwork in these bold and dynamic colors. As you can see in the Madonna of the Goldfinch, he's using perspective in creating this beautiful landscape. Although it looks a little bit more like Tuscany or Umbria in nature, he's depicted Virgin Mary, the Christ Child, and St. John the Baptist in a most believable landscape setting. Note the painting in the lower center of the screen, his magical, allegorical painting titled The Triumph of Galatea, a fresco from 1514. Here he draws inspiration not only from ancient Roman wall painting, especially in the bright colors and decoration, but also probably from his fellow artist Michelangelo. This is painted just 2 years after the completion of the Sistine ceiling, and the energetic intertwine of bodies in action recalls some of the dynamism found in portrayals by Michelangelo. But it was Pope Julius II, who's shown in the upper right, who commissioned Raphael to paint portions of his papal apartments. And here we see the sheer range and breadth of Raphael's talents in full force. One can only fantasize what a lunch break in the year 1509 might have been like for our 2 Renaissance men, who, although they were arch rivals, might possibly have discussed their morning's challenges atop the scaffolding that day. Raphael's School of Athens, shown here, recalls the grandeur of the old Athenian academy, where Aristotle and Plato, shown in the center, walk towards the viewer beneath this most central grand Roman arch. This fresco epitomizes humanism. We find gathered poets, writers, philosophers, astronomers, sculptors, and architects, all striving to understand man's role in the universe while making improvements to society. They intermingle, they interact in what appears to be a beehive of intellectual discourse. Raphael, as painter-architect, displays his architectural bravado in reviving the grandeur of the classical world. Although in point of fact, his architectural setting is more Roman than Athenian, we can forgive him for such artistic license. What grandeur, what an enveloping and embracing canopy of the Greco-Roman world he imagines. As mentioned earlier, Raphael, of our big 3 of the Renaissance men, would only live to be 37 years old. He began work here at the Vatican in 1509 and continued to work under the papal commissions until his death in 1520. For example, Michelangelo would live to the age of 89, dying some 44 years after Raphael. And one can only imagine what Raphael might have produced had he lived for another decade or 2, let alone 4. Let's turn our attention from the triumphs in painting during the Renaissance to other important areas of human achievement. For example, literature. The name Machiavelli is familiar to all of us and represents in the fields of both writing and philosophy this greater insight into the roles of power and politics during the early 16th century. The diplomat-philosopher rose to power after the de Medicis were thrown out of Florence in 1494 and is now seen as one of the founders of modern political science. His seminal work, a title familiar to many of us, The Prince, from around 1513, is a masterpiece of political statecraft, promoting the theory that immoral or deceitful behavior is justified by leaders as they attempt to ward off any challenges to their authority. I quote here, "A prince should stick to the path of good, but if the necessity arises, he should know how to follow evil." This view that corrupt immorality is a necessary part of effective leadership would eventually lead the Catholic Church to ban this classic work. And I should say that his legacy is constantly being reappraised by scholars, but yet we see how he was challenging himself in looking at contemporary Florence about guiding and thinking about how a society might function. Another important figure of literature during the Italian Renaissance is a man named Giorgio Vasari, who you see here. He wrote an important treatise, an important book about the lives of artists and architects that allows us to know so many of the stories about the lives of Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, and others. And in many ways, Vasari is seen as Italy's first art historian. Why is this? His classic work of 1550, titled The Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, records the biographical details and stories of these artists and blends a combination of facts with anecdotes. Vasari is also the first one to use the actual term Renaissance in print to describe the accomplishments and creative genius of his fellow Italians. We turn to another of Vasari's accomplishments, the design of what's known as the Vasari Corridor, a picture gallery and problem solver for the de' Medici family. This clever and at times inapparent pathway above the Arno River connects the Palazzo Vecchio with the Pitti Palace on the other side. Commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici in 1565, it allowed the Florentine elite to walk safely across the river from the city's seat of government to the de' Medici's private residence. Today, however, as you see in the upper right, it houses more than 1,000 paintings, most of which are self-portraits. The Uffizi has expanded its collection from Raphael, whose self-portrait you see in the lower left, to Rembrandt in the center, and his self-portrait here is one of 3 by Rembrandt in the Uffizi's collection, and also a self-portrait in the lower right by the French female 18th century artist Vigée Lebrun. Beyond an understanding of all the human triumphs that resulted in various fields from architecture, painting, sculpture, and literature, we need to also consider the human triumphs in the fields of invention and exploration. We've spoken of Leonardo da Vinci and his meticulous observations of human anatomy. These paved the way for progress in the medical sciences, foretelling advances in anatomical studies in later centuries. But we see science becoming particularly important in the 16th century. Represented here are 3 names and 3 pictures of people you all know. Galileo on the left, Amerigo Vespucci in the middle, and of course, Christopher Columbus on the right. Columbus from Genoa was once thought to have discovered America, embarking on his 4 journeys to the New World, as you know, in 1492. But please consider how in these years between 1492 and 1510, these household names, along with people like Vasco da Gama, let alone Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael, were all working, thriving, challenging themselves during these same years, pushing the boundaries in their fields and their contributions which would shape the world and world concerns for centuries later. Moreover, in the next century, another Italian, Galileo, would invent the telescope in 1609, opening the heavens to astronomers and expanding the territories for discovery beyond our terrestrial boundaries. Let's also consider the gentleman in the center, Amerigo Vespucci, the Florentine mariner and protege of the de' Medicis, who explored North America, and his early mapping would draw attention to the existence of a new world. Curiosity about man's position in the world and learning about the earth and the heavens and the cosmos were foremost for these thinkers and inventors and explorers of the 15th, but particularly 16th and 17th centuries. And the extraordinary achievements in the field of cartography throughout Europe, in Italy, and Northern Europe as well, were all certainly triumphs of the Renaissance period. And following Amerigo Vespucci's expeditions, the name America appears for the first time on a German map here by Martin Waldseemüller from 1507. So in thinking about why the Renaissance matters, this pivotal era in European history that bridges the medieval and modern worlds, the extraordinary output across all human endeavor within the fields of the arts, sciences, humanities during the 14th to 16th centuries. Humanism is at its core with a rediscovery of the writings, teachings, moral and ethical philosophies of the Greco-Roman world. Its legacy is apparent throughout our modern world. Today's universities, governments, and cultural institutions all trace their foundations back to the teachings of this period and to our understanding of the Greco-Roman world. One could argue that it was the Italian Renaissance that provided that important conduit between the classical world and the modern world, a bridge from the medieval way of thinking to the modern one. And it was that mindset to think and explore and observe. It was that mindset that brought to life so much that we know and accept as part of the human condition. How humanism drives all of us forward, almost at a jet propulsion speed, to tackle the tough questions in society and solve our problems, both as individuals and collectively as a society. So one might argue that it was the drive of humanism, the importance of the Italian Renaissance, which has been the underpinning for all of us in how we tackle the world and relish and enjoy the fact that as human beings, we can solve problems together. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Charles Doherty, the Chief Resident Historian for Viking Cruises. You've come to know me perhaps over the last 4 weeks, and this being our 5th week of explorations of different chapters of world history. Previously, we've looked at Greek civilization for 2 weeks before turning to the Roman Empire and then the Venetian Republic. And as many of you have just watched the Italian Renaissance lecture, we have opportunity to ask questions and learn more and get behind the scenes, perhaps, of some of the slides that were put on, included within the film. Now, I should mention, by way of background, the fact that hopefully there are many good, hopeful signs out there, not only in North America, the Northern Hemisphere. We're finding the days getting longer, warmer, easier, more enjoyable to be outside. I've had a chance to do lots of gardening this past week, so maybe a little bit of color to my cheeks. But hopefully all these are boding well for all of us. When we're not inside watching Viking Live TV, we're able to get outside and enjoy life a little bit more. As you remember, perhaps for those watching last week, I'd given you assignment to ask a question. The question I asked was, what do you remember about a first visit to some place in the world, some world city, world capital, or perhaps a foreign country, and to share that with a loved one, perhaps over a dinner table, or grandchildren over Skype or FaceTime or something like that. And I thought I'd begin by mentioning my first visit to Venice. It was a most memorable one. This was back in the late 1970s. I was a young wannabe art historian, and I was traveling on what was called a Eurail pass. For those of you who are British, it's equivalent to Interrail. And if I recall correctly, for a 7-day pass or 14, 15 days, maybe a month, you could have unlimited rides on trains, most of the trains just jumping on and off. Essentially, there was no need to queue, that kind of thing, for tickets. Well, I arrived in Venice in August, deathly hot, crowded with people, on a night train from Northern Europe. And I didn't have a place to stay. And I just, in my enthusiasm in using that manual, that Bible called Let's Go Europe, went to the various youth hostels, didn't find any beds available, and then tried pensions and as much as I could afford in terms of a hotel room, nothing. So about 11:15 in the morning, I thought, right, we'll take my backpack to the train station. In those days, you could leave it left luggage. And I, with great feverish excitement, went to every altarpiece, museum, piece of sculpture, piece of architecture, everything I could possibly take in one day, and then collapsed, had a bowl of pasta before jumping on the next night train anywhere north. And I mention this because I've been to Venice maybe 30 times, I don't even know, but yet that is among the most memorable of that day when I saw Venice, as much as Venice as I possibly could in one day. So again, think about these things, challenge yourself, and share these stories with others, maybe things that you've never articulated with someone that you've known for a number of years. Well, again, hopefully you're enjoying the programs on Viking Live TV. And I just wanted to thank you again for your great questions and your enthusiasm for the program. Just to start out, by way of introduction, Shar in Great Falls has asked if I normally serve as a VRH on the Mediterranean cruises. and the Adriatic. And just wondering, where or how I happen to serve on Viking. Well, it turns out I am on only sporadically. It's kind of where I'm needed as such. And I'll tell you more at the end about how I actually happen to get involved with Viking, because therein lies another interesting tale. Jerry in Kent in Ohio has asked, when we were in Florence some years ago, we saw a building with a plaque to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the plaque being on one corner in Florence. Do you know the story or reason for that? Well, Jerry, it's interesting. I don't. I'm going to surmise, again, I just received the question. I'm going to surmise that Longfellow obviously was associated with that corner, perhaps that maybe he lived in that building when composing one of his poems or stories. I don't know the story, but I'll find out for you. How's that? Just to address a number of other questions and things that have come in. I should, by way of background, mention the term humanism, which I used during the Greek civilization lectures, as well in today's episode on the Italian Renaissance. Humanism itself is a term from the early 19th century that was coined by a German theologian. And it was really about how people were looking to classical literature for inspiration about human ideals and that sort of thing. Well, the term has been greatly expanded, and I used it then in talking about Greek civilization, and as well in today's lecture, to talk about how it is a human-oriented focus or a sense of purpose within a society, somewhat different from, let's say, one based upon religion and religious theology. And so it's really more of a man-centered, human-centered society rather than a God-centered society. And so that's just to set up that parallel by way of explanation. It's also by way of explanation. I debated in writing this lecture and then recording it, whether to change that phrase Renaissance man to, let's say, Renaissance polymath or something. But, yes, that may be gender neutral and maybe a little bit more accurate, but it kind of sounded pretentious. It sounded a little bit kind of like I was trying to elevate myself and my, erudite nature or something, and that's just not me. And I know that the demographics for many of our Viking guests, you grew up with and knew this term Renaissance man, and hence why I employed it for purposes of lecturing on the subject of the 15th century in Italy. Similarly, thinking about how when we talk about this, command and interest in seizing all avenues of interest and learning from one another that was part of that classical world, this too was so important during the 15th century. But as in the classical world, it was largely men. And again, I'm not being sexist, but again, just to bring this thread back into our conversation here, women in 15th century Italy were largely subjugated, largely tied to the home, involved with household chores and aspects of motherhood and rearing children. And similarly, even if you were a woman of wealth who might have hired help in the house, you still were rather housebound. Now, there were wealthy women, of course, by virtue of privilege, who were able and managed to escape this kind of stereotype that I'm unfortunately painting. But in the end, it has to be said that women had few rights, both legal or societal. And again, it was the constraints, really, of a gender-oriented male universe. And it is interesting to think about, again, from a historical perspective. It wasn't until the early 1890s, I think it was 1894, if I could remember correctly, in New Zealand, where women first had the right to vote in terms of national suffrage. And in North America, we're talking about early 20th century as well in Britain. So this idea or concept about women having a prominence on the stage is so oftentimes forgotten by younger women who have forgotten really how this is such a recent phenomenon for women having so many equal powers in society. And again, we still have the strains of lack of equal pay for women. Don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting for a moment that men and women are on the same level plateau. But again, the progress of the last 100 years is extraordinary in comparison to the epoch of previous centuries. Well, I thought I would also bring up a couple other things for you about how, we talk about these great men of the Renaissance, and we have tried to bring up and just to crystallize for you three of these great artists, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Raphael. And we need to remember how that cross-pollination, fertilization, excitement, which we saw in Athens, in the school of Athens, in all this inquisitiveness that was just a part of being an Athenian. We find that same energy reborn, not just in Florence, but other Renaissance cities. There was that slide mentioning about things happening in everywhere from Genoa and Venice and Rome and Milan, etc. And the fact that I've boiled this down, I've just done three artists, if you will. I did Masaccio, I think, earlier on. When I was in graduate school, I had an entire semester, nothing but Italian art of the 15th century. So this tall order of pulling together what might be the benchmarks, the important points for consideration, all in a 45-minute lecture. Of course, we've left out your favorite artist or your favorite building, or perhaps reference to some of the societal, political, military things going on in Italy during these years. But again, these lectures are meant to be just cornerstone kind of benchmarks for further exploration. But in thinking about various kind of genius aspects that were addressed in the lecture, I need to also remind you and recommend a couple of books that will help you learn more. More specifically, Leonardo da Vinci, those slides couldn't possibly do him justice. The fact that he compiled, I think it's 7,200 journal page entries with all of that fine minutia, those annotations, those scribble-like doodles, sometimes looking cartoonesque to our eyes. Everything from imagined inventions to he had dissected or been a part of observing 20 different cadavers, and that peeling back of the skin and that exploring what's beneath layer upon layer made just incredible discoveries, which largely went under, if not unappreciated, for centuries. For example, he had described Newton's first and third law of motion some 200 years before Newton. Or the other one that's amazing, he had described the workings, the mechanical nature of the aortic valve, the heart valve, I think it's 350 years before medical researchers had been able to understand it. So you get the idea. He is, this word genius is overused, but I would highly recommend for those wanting to learn more to turn to the book whose cover I'm showing you here by Walter Isaacson, the biography of Leonardo da Vinci. And Walter Isaacson is a name that many of you know, perhaps know his writings. He's an author, historian associated with the Tulane University. But also, he wrote a definitive biography on Steve Jobs that came out in 2011, soon after Steve Jobs' death. Then followed that with biographies of Einstein and Benjamin Franklin. And again, this one, as I mentioned, came out in 2017. I think I said that, but it's 599 pages long, which may be a little bit short on the art historical analysis, but incredibly comprehensive in thinking about this mind, how it worked, about his personality. And again, you'll be greatly rewarded for those of you seeking out this book rewarded to learn more about Leonardo da Vinci. I should also mention in terms of Michelangelo, the fact that in that lecture, again, I have a chance to revisit, to rewatch the lecture, usually within 24 hours of when I come on board with you on Tuesday afternoons here in America. And it was interesting in the Michelangelo description, we cut the slide that showed you the Sistine ceiling and then the Last Judgment that was 25 years later. And I mentioned the fact that you could see or notice how they looked, somewhat differently. Well, it is quite amazing, the fact that this was completed over 4 years, the Last Judgment at the end of the Sistine Chapel was completed when the artist was 67 years old. And it portrays, as you can imagine, this idea of the second coming of Christ and the judgment of God about who shall be saved and who shall be damned. And the interlay and complexity of the composition and the body forms is a little bit more dramatic, almost proto-Baroque, if I could use that term, to describe this power, energy, dynamism. Essentially, the volume has been pumped up since the Sistine ceiling. And it's interesting also how there's a blue background for the sky, which so predominates this huge wall at the end of the chapel. And it was originally thought that the figures were a bit monochromatic, and the fact that they all kind of blended together against this heavenly sky. But upon cleaning, as we witnessed with the Sistine ceiling, some of those probably intended richer colors, those melony, citrusy, bluey, pink kind of tones emerged among those figures. But again, I apologize the fact that hadn't been clearly articulated how Michelangelo himself was growing and expanding over the course of his lifetime. I might also mention, in terms of how these lectures are meant to be just touchstones of different kind of points to be considered and to learn more about. And it's interesting how academia is pursuing not just gender studies, but inequality, injustice topics, let alone those about wealth inequality. Not looking at history just in terms of kings and queens and military things and who begat whom and who overpowered whom in terms of empire and struggles, but rather looking at the personal nature of real lives and real people. And I'm not sure if you know, but Michelangelo had written more than, I think it was 300 sonnets and madrigals and things, some addressed to both men and women. And it was his grandnephew in the 1520s published these sonnets and deliberately changed all the pronouns from men to women as a means of protecting some of Michelangelo's proclivities. And I should mention how, in terms of a question, this one didn't come in today, but as a question from one of my undergraduates one time that I've never forgotten. And this young man was probably 19 or 20 years old, and I could surmise maybe a fraternity brother or something of that nature. And he raised his hand upon looking at, and we looked at the Sistine ceiling, and we looked at the Medici tombs where there's the figures of dawn and dusk there in marble. And this young man said, "Dr. D, I have a question. Why is it that all of Michelangelo's women look like nude men wearing coconuts?" Okay, remember, this is a 19 to 20-year-old, frat boy kind of mentality. For those of you not familiar with the fraternity system in America, let's just say you might be familiar with the James Michener story, South Pacific, and the film version, in which we find American GIs doing various plays and songs and things on their South Pacific island, men in grass skirts wearing coconuts literally to impersonate women. Okay, so that's the background. Well, it turns out because of Michelangelo's proclivities and not to mention the power and dynamism of portraying musculature and the protuberance of different shapes that come with forms of biceps and muscular legs, let alone abdominal ridges and all these kind of things. that from 70 feet, let's say, between the platform, the ground, if you will, in the Sistine Chapel, and the painted portions up above, the dynamism and the more overt musculature and the drama and power was perhaps a little bit more easier to communicate, but also to visually read from 70 feet below. So that in part may be a reason, or maybe explaining his robust women without much, let's say, anatomical observation. I mentioned this also just thinking about how all of these things are evolving and changing, and how things are taught differently today than when many of us were at college and university. The Medicis, again, this is one of those I stumbled upon last night in watching the video. I mentioned something about, in reference to Machiavelli, and how the Medicis had been banished from Florence in 1494. And that just came out of the blue because in terms of trying to keep it to 45 minutes, we'd cut an earlier portion. The Medicis were essentially expelled from Florence twice. One time it was Cosimo in the early 1430s, and he just happened to be on the wrong side of a feud among families, and thankfully he had moved much of that family wealth to neighboring Italian cities, and so it was kind of a non-event. But the second time, the one in 1494, with one of his descendants, Pietro, this was more serious. It turned out with Charles VIII of France in Naples, making his way toward Florence. In order to appease him, Pietro was surrendering portions of, and eventually Florence, to the French king. The idea didn't work. Essentially, Pietro spent his last years in exile, dying in 1503 without returning to Florence. But it was not until 1512, 1503 he died, 1512 that the Medicis returned to Florence. Well, I'm just now checking to make sure that we, in terms of additional questions coming in, we have a couple here. Did the artists who work, and this is from Karen in Ellicott City, who writes, did the artists who work at the Vatican have free reign on choice of subjects, or were general themes or subjects suggested to them? Well, it depends. It's a great question, Karen. We have some knowledge about this from Giorgio Vasari, who wrote in the mid-16th century about different artists and their lives. And as well, some of these are anecdotal, some are actually, quite helpful to understand. And I would say that there was a somewhat of a free reign. For example, Raphael, in portraying the papal apartments, he was able to do the School of Athens, for example, without, the Pope asking for that particular composition. And I imagine that, we know that Michelangelo was given some sort of directives about the Sistine ceiling in keeping to an Old Testament theme framework, but the creativity and the infusion and a lot of the dynamism, which we so appreciate and love, would have been largely of his own creation. Rick in Charlotte, in North Carolina. Hello, Rick. Did the Italian Renaissance artists think the earlier Greek and Roman sculptures inferior? Wow, that's a really good one. I could answer that in two ways. On the one hand, they were so enamored and enthralled with whatever archaeological fragments were emerging, like the Barberini torso and some of these others that were, so overtly over-the-top Hellenistic marble sculptures that they would have been phantasmagorical, if I could use that word, of something beyond the pale of what was emerging or had been seen in religious art, up to that point of the mid to late 15th century. So I don't think they would have thought them being inferior. I think they would have found them most curious. But in the same vein, I think there must have been that proverbial sense of you borrow from the past, so you're looking at tradition, but you're infusing it with your own creativity and inspiration. And really, in the history of art, that's what great art is all about. Something that borrows from the past, but you make it modern. You make it contemporary. You make it something of you. So I don't know, again, if I've answered your question, but I don't think they would have found them inferior. I think they would have found them to be propulsively, demonstrably inspirational in trying to create new things of this new era in the 15th century in Florence. Just moving on, Emily in Broomfield, hello Emily, said, how did the plague change society? Well, we talked about this a little bit previously, and again, I know that the map was there in this lecture as well to set the stage about what was happening in Europe, especially understanding the plague in reference to both Dante's Inferno and the Decameron by Boccaccio. But about how to change society, I think it was really more a radical sense of, as I mentioned last week, 40 to 60% of some rural communities were lost. And so from that idea of labor shortages and the idea of markets for food and all of these things would have had serious economic disruptions, not to mention just kind of social and cultural. So I guess what I would really want you to do, Emily, is to kind of go back and look at and think about how a society adapts or changes when you have a workforce that may be only half the size, you have a market that only needs half of what it needed in that earlier decade or decades. There would have been lots of changes, and I'm not even touching on the emotional, the scarring, the fear of what that would be like to have lived through. Carolyn in Barnesville, Minnesota. Remember, when I'm reading these questions, I have really no idea where it's going, but she says, amazing information that brings back wonderful memories of our trip to Italy. How are you able to pack such vast knowledge into 1 hour? I don't. I try. I only try. Will you be continuing the study of Italy? We all continue studying Italy. It's really what keeps us all going. It's that inquisitiveness, that curiosity, that wondering how or why someone is able to produce something that is so magical and beautiful. And, if I just mentioned, nobody's asked this, but did you have any artists from the 15th century that you didn't include? And, Piero della Francesca. I made a pilgrimage to this town called Arezzo in Tuscany to see one particular fresco cycle. Michelangelo's teacher named Ghirlandaio, who I mentioned just briefly as having some paintings in the lower register of the Sistine ceiling. Many, many others. And, my students used to say, we can tell when you really like something because you talk faster and you use more polysyllabic words. Sorry. But anyway, Carolyn, yeah, we're all still learning, and I hope you are inspired to continue learning about not just Italy, but our wonderful world. Let's see if I can find another one for you. I just have to refresh this 1 second. Sorry about that. Lenny, if I pronounce your name correctly in Oslo, thank you for joining us, Lenny. It must be late for you. Fantastic program. Why did Leonardo never paint any eyebrows in the painting? Mona Lisa and also the rest. I don't know, Lenny, about the history of eyebrows, the pronounced use of makeup to accentuate eyebrows. My honest answer is I don't know, but I'd love to share a little story with you. It turns out that Leonardo was working on painting the Mona Lisa for some 15 years. And this is the zinger for you. It was in his bedroom when he died. So again, one can only imagine how important this work was to him. And Lenny, pardon me if I'm being a little bit silly here. Maybe he just didn't get to the eyebrows yet. Maybe that was in the 16th year, I don't know. Interesting question. John in Incline Village. Thank you, John. You've been asking great questions over the time. I'm glad we can get to one. I wonder if the Wright brothers borrowed, he puts in quotations, some of Leonardo da Vinci's designs for the Wright Flyer in 1903. There appear to be a lot of design similarities. Interesting, John. He revealed in a previous question that he's a pilot. And I don't think, again, I can find this out for you, about when were those journal entries with the picture of the flying machine, when were they first published? And my hunch, I can't say this for certain, but my hunch is the fact that those designs were published later, after the Wright brothers' first flight. And so I think it may just be coincidence. So again, thinking I'm watching our time here and wanting to make certain that I can hit a couple of other points. But the growth of universities being so important for the promulgation of ideas and curiosity. We talked about this Renaissance, this rebirth, if you will, during the 15th century, not just in Florence, but other places in Italy. But we have to remember there was a rebirth, a Renaissance of sorts with a small r, in various parts of Europe after the year 1000, and those monasteries which were copying those illuminated manuscripts and those gospels and doing some notations and annotations of the human form, carving small objects in ivory. There was a continuation through the Roman Catholic monasteries about some of these classical ideas. And then it was from those monasteries we saw the rise of the great universities across Europe. And these are largely in the last quarter to last half of the 11th century. We find the University of Bologna, University of Paris, two of the earliest universities. And at first it was about scientific and kind of inquiry, but then, expanded to involve and envelop so many different avenues of learning. And it was not only aided then by the discovery, in quotes, of the New World in 1492, let alone by the Protestant Reformation in the early part of the 16th century, the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century. All of these, again, were springboards for further inquiry. And, it's interesting how, this has been kind of a part of American discourse for the last 15, 20 years of kind of an anti-intellectualism and not believing the scientists or whatever. But if we look at history, it has largely been the advancement of people testing hypotheses, doing things in laboratories, doing trials, whatever it might be, to ascertain the truth or the direction for solving problems. And so we need to, again, give a heads up, a handshake, a proverbial smile to all those working in laboratories around the world as I speak. The fact that it largely has been science that has allowed us to get to the other side. Well, Florence, as one of you mentioned about, visiting Florence and having a wonderful time, really still defines itself by virtue of the glories of the 15th century. And in light of that, I was thinking about, so what could I recommend for those of you spending a little bit more time at home, and in terms of a book or a film dealing with Florence? And of course, I came up with A Room with a View. Here's the movie poster. Many of you know or remember the film from 1985, a Merchant in Ivory film, but based upon an E.M. Forster novel from 1908. It's a wonderful film with Maggie Smith, Judi Dench, young Daniel Day-Lewis, Bonham Carter. It's a woman, I don't remember the blonde heartthrob's name, but anyway, great film, 8 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture. I saw it last year, again, after 30 years or whatever. And it was a bit slow at times in places, but it still evokes this kind of Edwardian romance of being British tourists in Florence during those years. So that might be a good one. For those of you interested in learning more about Italian Renaissance art, I have to turn, this is the cover, to the 7th edition of Frederick Hart's textbook, which is very readable, very approachable. But again, in its 7th edition, he died in 1991. He was the Italian specialist, University of Virginia, chairman of the art history department. But he died in 1991, but this book is still being updated and revised. That would be your go-to book, again, The History of Italian Renaissance by Frederick Hart, H-A-R-T-T. Well, let's see what else I have in my little show and tell bag here. Oh, to mention, I referred previously there was a slide about the Holy Roman Empire in this lecture, but I referred to it by virtue of a question earlier. And this is the cover for the book of the Holy Roman Empire by Peter Wilson, highly recommended. It's just about 1,000 pages, so it devotes maybe a page a year, if you will, to that institution that Voltaire called neither holy nor Roman nor empirical, and written by an All Souls College Don from Oxford. Highly recommended. Again, that would be your source for learning more there. And last but not least, I need to mention how, we can't possibly cover all the topics that you want in one, mere 45-minute lecture. But I get this question all the time on board the ship, and it may be on your minds as well. How did I ever get involved with Viking? Well, it goes back to a man by the name of Paul Dawson, who you will be hearing from next week. I'll explain that in a moment. But Paul and I are colleagues at a university in Bordeaux, where I teach kind of different seminars for 3 different times over the course of the year. And it turns out that Paul and Karina Hagen had a mutual friend who was getting married in the UK, and I am going to guess around 2012, 2013, something in there. And they exchanged business cards. And at some point later, Karina called up Paul, along with Vince, and said that they were coming to Bordeaux because Viking was doing the work to figure out a Viking Bordeaux river trip. So Paul got involved in helping with some aspects of the itinerary, the tours, that kind of thing. And Paul included me to help with writing of some of the lectures, 3 lectures that we had for the cruise director to give on board. Well, I was invited to dine with the Hagens the night before on the Forsetti, the night before the first ship, before she was launched, the first sailing of that itinerary. And was approached then later when Viking Ocean started getting going to pilot this program, the creation of a resident historian program. So Paul Dawson is really the reason why I'm here, and he's going to be taking over for me next week. A History of Spain is a lecture that he's written. It's going to be a good time, and he will do the question and answer period after. And I will return in 2 weeks from today to do the History of the Netherlands, Part 1 and Part 2. Unfortunately, my parrot tulips and exotic harlequin tulips are now in bloom, so I can't have those behind me in 2 or 3 weeks. But suffice it to say, we'll be back here, hopefully a lot more gardening under my belt. And again, hopefully we're all going to be feeling better and better about life. So as I always say, please stay home. We're not over this yet, but please try to stay fit, keep walking, keep active, keep watching these wonderful programs on Viking Live TV. I'm looking forward to the program tomorrow, by the way, with Haywood Hill. They are the London book agents to supply all those wonderful books on board our ocean vessels. And, these are books, they're not tour guides, they're not guidebooks, they're not coffee table books. There's, really esoteric, wonderful things. That book, the Holy Roman Empire title, I first found this on Viking ship in terms of writing a lecture. Mr. Hagen talks about us being the thinking person's cruise company. In this instance, we walk the walk, talk the talk. The books, the library is amazing, catering to all of those thinkers out there like yourselves. So with that, I say goodbye for now. See you in 2 weeks. All the best.